Welcome, everybody. I am really happy to have my friend, my colleague, Roger Wolsey on, and we are going to be talking about his new book, Discovering Fire. Discovering Fire, Spiritual Practices That Transform Lives. This is a conversation I've been looking forward to for a while. If you've been around progressive Christianity for really the last decade plus, you might be familiar with Roger's inaugural book called Kissing Fish, which became something of an indie publishing sensation, exploring tenets and propositions for a progressive Christianity that allows us to have our hearts and our minds engaged. And Discovering Fire, in a lot of ways, continues that trend. And I just want to read you actually my endorsement for the book because it really encapsulates what I find to be so intriguing about it. What I said was, in Kissing Fish, spiritual director and pastor Roger Wolsey gives readers conceptual frameworks for reconsidering Christianity in a way that's intellectually coherent, morally generative, and compassionately grounded. Over a decade later, in Discovering Fire, he deepens this conversation by showing us how to practice a wide-awake faith that's centered in the way of Jesus, while embodying a spiritual hospitality that includes fuel offered by neighboring traditions, and rediscovering the hidden sparks in our own. So take up this book if you're wanting to rekindle your spirit to a roaring flame, but be aware, the fire starters Roger describes might rub you strangely at first as they're heating up. He leaves nothing he's found helpful out, from contemplative prayer to circling, fasting to plant medicine, tarot reading to ecstatic dance. Discovering Fire is an unflinchingly honest dive into generating genuine heat and light for progressive Christians and the spiritually homeless alike. Highly recommended. So, Roger, thank you for being here with us.
It's a real honor, and that is a beautiful endorsement. And I can tell you actually read the book, so that feels good. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No ChatGPT endorsements for me. Uh, yeah. So why don't we dive right in? The premise that you begin your book with is, of course, and it's not a controversial one at this point. You say religion in the West is in crisis. People are fleeing in droves. The fastest growing spiritual populations are those who identify as spiritual but not religious, or as nones, as in none of the above. Temples, mosques, and churches are increasingly populated primarily with gray-haired people. For the first time in U.S. history, less than 50% of the population are members of congregations, synagogues, or mosques, and it's likely that Christians will comprise less than half of the U.S. population sooner than the church wants to admit. And you go on to say that, folks are leaving, and yet there are these possibilities for both fire within our own traditions as well as fire starters that you've discovered in your life in a lot of other traditions. I feel like in a lot of ways, Roger, you and I have lived parallel lives. Even though I've never formally been in ministry, I've been very ministry adjacent as an author, as a facilitator, as, sparking fires with other authors. And, we both grew up as children of the church who, in the course of our lived lives, which, include parallels, more recently for me than for you, but including divorce, including having children who are growing up and just being, both teachers and seekers, we've explored these other helpful modalities from this rich stew of both, global spiritual traditions, as well as, what I would call it kind of this American pragmatism, counterculture, human potential movement that we bring this sort of can-do attitude to even our inner growth. And there's, so many things that have been innovated through that with regards to shadow work and circling and authentic relating and very niche practices that perhaps by virtue of you having lived so long in Boulder and me now having lived so long in Asheville, that we've gotten to experience and to synthesize in our journeys. And so I want to hear from you a little bit more. Why do you think religion is in crisis?
Yeah. So there's different ways to get at that. I'll just start naming a few. One is we are in a truly information age, and people are aware that no one religion can really say that they can have a monopoly. There are various valid religions that have long lineages that are millions, billions of people are part of. And it's increasingly absurd, I think, for many people to think that any one religion has it all or can claim to be the one true, accurate, only religion. So part of it is to the extent that certain religions are exclusivistic and tend to not welcome outside views or put others down, that is off-putting to many people. So that's one piece. Another piece of it is, well, there's been certainly in all kinds of traditions, instances of scandal and hypocrisy where various leaders in religions are saying one thing but doing something quite different. And people's bullshit radars are pretty strong these days. And if the news shows more scandal and people screwing up rather than the good that they might be doing in the world, well, that it affects things. And there's really not really secrets that can be kept much in this era of information. So that's another piece of it is that I think a lot of people like Jesus. If they've done any reading at all, they tend to like Jesus. It's his followers, as it's cliche put it, that they have trouble with sometimes. Uh, Happily, I do know sincere practicing Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and Christians that really are beautiful representatives of their faith. But not everybody is so fortunate to know the folks that are doing it sincerely and beautifully. Another piece of it is, I would say, the failure of the religions to act to adequately tend to the human aggravated global warming crisis. This has been happening on our watches, and we have all collectively done little. There's been a moral quietude, sticking our head in the sand. Some people ridiculously hoping that, God's going to take care of this and therefore we don't have to. That kind of stuff is really off-putting. Seeing that profound failure of entities that should know better failing, that's probably part of it. And then another piece of it is there are a lot of, say, conventional members of various religions that have a less than notable transformation in their lives, a little shift, uh, slightly nicer, say thank you, maybe you send the thank you card more frequently, maybe send money to some charity once a year. There's slight incremental change, but not necessarily a lifestyle change, a transformation that's so obvious. And so all of these traditions do allow for profound transformation, but a whole lot of folks are more content to stay in the shallow end of the pool. And if that's what people see, it isn't all that compelling. Well, I can be nice too. I can be a little nicer. I can do a little bit more healing. And if it's only incremental, slight change that people are seeing and not full on transformation, that doesn't really speak well of the tradition. So that all of those things combined, I think, might be an answer. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. What I'm hearing you saying is that, for many millennia, religion has been the de facto upholder of supposed morality and growth in a village, in a community, in a nation state. It's been the unquestioned. This is who we look to as our standard for what's possible and what's right and what's good. And in our contemporary information age, we are only too aware of the foibles of any religious tradition and the downside and the ways in which we as religious folks don't live up to our own PR in terms of our supposed integrity, morality, prophetic witness, growth arc, etc. And so, yeah, people are rightly seeing the disparity between what we say and what we do. And so, as you say, a lot of people have turned to spirituality, to being spiritual but not religious, and are seemingly finding more life there. What you lived in Boulder for a long time. I live in Asheville, both very spiritual hubs where in some ways spirituality is just as ubiquitous as religion may have been a generation ago. And I think that probably gives you a unique perspective as to the ups and downs of spirituality as a standalone offering. What would you say are the benefits that you witness, and are there downsides?
Yeah, so I have thought about this, as you can imagine, and witnessing, connecting with people, dating people, the whole range of getting to know people and seeing things. Um, well, first of all, I don't want to critique something else without owning that I still have my work to do. I've got hypocrisy, I've got integrity work, I've got gaps that need to close.
Yeah.
So let me just own that as I begin. But there is a certain truth that many people who are engaged in the spiritual but not religious practices, there's a tendency for it to be a bit narcissistic, self-oriented rather than other-oriented. And, maybe becoming more serene through meditation as you exploit others through your financial venture capitalist means, okay, right? Interesting. Or you've got some more skills in talking and relating, and maybe your love life's a little better because of that. Okay. And yet you've got a high percentage of people in your community who are unhoused, and you're spending far more money on your dog and your cat than you are on anybody on the streets. How is your transformation doing any good to God's people in need? And very often there's a blind spot in these things, these offerings that don't help people connect their kirtan, their yoga, their spiral dynamics work, whatever, to actually helping people and having the world be able to say, yeah, my life is better because of these people helping me out.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Growing up in evangelicalism, I certainly witnessed a lot of churches, congregations that were very self-serving in terms of how they spent their budgets. A lot of money went to senior pastor, and, not much really circulated back in the community. But then, for the last couple of decades, really longer, honestly, than I was ever evangelical, being involved in more emotionally healthy, progressive churches and congregations, sometimes the ministers are part-time and a majority of the budget goes towards helping the community and being with the community. Mm-hmm. And, I love, as you do, the spiritual practices and technologies that I've learned from outside the church, but sometimes I am disturbed that it seems to be a very pay-to-play model that is not very economically accessible to a lot of folks. And yeah, sometimes I really long for, as I believe you do too, the best of both worlds. Can we have a genuine parish model of serving others that is not for profit, combined with some of these really beautiful modalities that have been innovated and adapted?
Yep, we are on the same page. Very, very much kindred spirits on that awareness and that yearning. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, somewhat counterculturally, I think you describe yourself in these pages as spiritual and religious. And so tell me, why is the and important to you?
Yeah. So I use some analogies to help get at this a little bit. So I play trumpet, and one of my spiritual practices is playing trumpet. In Boulder, there was a bridge on Broadway near the Dushanbe Tea House, and I would play under the bridge. The acoustics were great, and little recitals to God. I didn't have my suitcase open, the trumpet case, for money or anything. It was just because I wanted to practice. I love the acoustics, and a way to commune, co-create with God, and put smiles on people's faces. And I grow as a musician if I have opportunities to play in community bands or a project helping do a pit band for a local theater, or add some color to someone's album, those kind of projects where I'm collaborating with other musicians. Well, that's where I grow. And on my own, I have a limited growth of what I can do and think and create on my own. But as I'm exposed to other musicians, I learn more and am stretched and challenged. And uh, so that's part of it. And then also I have a chance to contribute to someone else's growth and hey, have you tried this? And it's more dynamic. There's a synergy. So I love solo practice, which I consider spiritual practice is playing trumpet by myself, but I love religion too, where I'm playing with others and we're doing a shared thing together and there's benefit with that. And I love both. So that's an analogy that maybe helps convey this. I'm not just a spiritualist, generic, untethered. I do better with rooting in one lineage. Jesus is my love language. I'm not literalistic about it. I'm not fundamentalist, but I love Jesus of Nazareth, his teachings, his way, his example. And I love communing with others who want to break bread and remember Jesus and help each other to be better followers of Jesus and sing together and break bread together and roll up our sleeves and do a organized religion. You can actually help more rather than just random acts of kindness. You can actually pay off the medical debt of everybody in your town. Churches have been doing that sort of thing. Well, that's organized religion doing good work. And one person probably couldn't pull that off. So those are the kinds of things where I yearn my private spiritual practice solo, and I love doing it with others. So that's how I convey that.
Beautiful. Yeah, what I hear you saying is that spirituality in communal practice with consistency and organization and thought over time is religion. It is the way that we can actually be more intentional and consistent with our spirituality, and that having specificity, having rootedness in a tradition, you also find to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I do too. And one thing that I would say is that specificity need not mean exclusivity.
Exactly.
We can be open-handed, open-hearted, but also stay in our lane and kind of know where our roots are and know the well springs from which we can really grow. But, part of the genius of discovering fire is that you do want to cross-pollinate different practices from different communities. And so I'm wondering, what are your top 3 emerging practices that you wish Christians were aware of and practice that are drawn from other religious traditions or this wider culture of the human potential movement?
It's challenging to limit it to 3, but let me.
I know you wrote a whole book about which the ultimate answer is read the book for all. Right. But for right now, we want to.
All right, so attuning to nature, I think, would be a priority. Now, there is a long lineage, Augustine, Jesus. There is value of being in nature. It is a book to experience the Creator. But very few Christians that I know of are doing much other than going out fishing, playing golf, maybe spend 30 minutes in the garden. And those are helpful to some extent, but really making a point to be intentional in creation, in a city park, in a state park, in a farmer's field, whatever you've got, and truly dropping in and communing and noticing the clouds, the angle of the sun, the aphid on the leaf, the slight movement of the grass as the wind moves. I mean, this is the stuff of getting out of yourself, experiencing creation, our own connection to it. It's not like we're not part of nature, but so realizing that we're part of nature and increasing our give a damn, our care about creation because of spending quality time. So if I'm spending 20 minutes a day in a forest or sitting under a tree or taking a walk, I'm going to care about that, at least that park. And I know other people care about their parks. And if I know that, and then I realize places like, I don't know, Gaza, the Ukraine, where there's just a lack of beauty right now. Oh, how desolating that is. And how absurd for me to live in such vast greenery and to knowing there are people who don't have that. It'd be kind of obscene for me not to make use of dropping into the beauty that's right around me. I couldn't sleep at night under that circumstance. So I make a point every day to take a walk, notice, take a photo, to really try to be present. So I think that the well-being of the planet hinges on this. We all need to be communing in nature, communing with nature, connecting to creator creation. That's a priority. So that's one. Another one that I'll name is, I guess, well, the chapter 7 is about reading and writing poetry as a spiritual practice, and it's not a small chapter; it's significant. Um, and I think as we read the poetry of others, people from other religious traditions, people that are not part of religious traditions, that's a way we get to connect with soul and maybe cosmic oneness. That soul speaking to soul, and good poetry isn't limited to any lineage. A good Sufi poem, a good Kabbalah poem, a good Christian mystic poem. There is something there for all humanity to feel we're not alone, to feel the yearning, to feel the pain, to sense the promise, the joy, the epiphany of what could be. I think that's a place to spend some time. Um, I'll also name something about getting in the body. Maybe it's yoga. Maybe it's ecstatic dance. Yoga is pretty accessible to many people these days. And there are fewer and fewer churches that are taboo about it. There are still a few, but anything to get us out of our heads and more into our bodies, I think can only be beneficial, not just for our own individual well-being, which helps us to be better vessels to live longer and be of service longer, but there's a need for us, many of us, to have a less cerebral way of experiencing God and feel it in our bodies. So practices that help that along, I think would be good. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just to riff on these for a moment, totally agree with all three of them. When I moved to Western North Carolina, where I live, about 7 years ago, one of the reasons I came here was because of more of the immediacy of nature and the culture here of spending more time outside. And, very quickly after that, did a permaculture certification where I learned how we can build and live and be with the flow of our surroundings rather than being these sort of, anthropocentric colonizers who very stupidly sometimes build things where it requires way more money for us to heat and cool because we don't know what direction the sun is in at what time of day. Just so many things that are, common indigenous wisdoms that, especially we as white people tend to overlook. And then, another offering, my dear friend, Sarah Lynch Thomason, she does this thing called Singing the Wheel of the Year, which is this pagan and animist way of looking at, various nature-based observances. And how do we revere the animate world as our friends, as our allies? How do we even speak to them in more personal language when we're spending time? And I just find all of that to be so helpful. And similarly with poetry, it's where would I be without Rilke, without Hafez, without Mary Oliver? There's just so many poems that evoke our souls. And what I love about your chapter there is you not only encourage us to read good poetry, but you give us full permission to write our own poetry, even if it might be mediocre at first, but as a way of authentic soul expression. And
Yeah.
I really appreciate how you vulnerably, shared a lot of your own poetry there. Um,
Yeah.
that was beautiful, and yeah, definitely a yes to getting more in our bodies. I have two left feet. Sometimes ecstatic dance feels awkward to me, but I do appreciate also this modality called Feldenkrais, which is another embodiment. It's a little bit more of a Western tradition. Just some
Mhm.
yoga might be more from the East, but I agree. If there's one huge glaring gap in a lot of Christian formation, it's the fact that we have bodies. And it's kind of weird when you think about our faith being incarnational, the idea of God and fleshed, that we spend so little time with our flesh, don't we? So,
Hmm.
yeah. And then what would you say, conversely, because you're writing to a couple audiences, and I told you this when we were preparing for this, but I went to my very first regional burn this past weekend. So a regional burn, for those of you who don't know, is associated with, a large festival that happens every year called Burning Man, out in the deserts. But burns are a culture of minimal ecological impact, maximal sharing, and artistic expression. And so I brought a copy to the theme camp that I was staying at. And
Hmm.
most of the people who were present there were not Christians, did not have Christian backgrounds, and they were enjoying diving in. They were enjoying looking at the practices that you recommend. Both I think they enjoyed seeing their own practices, shared in a fair and generous way, but also that you said, hey, if you understandably gave up on Christianity or the church because of trauma, you might be overlooking some really cool nuggets that you do have permission to use, even if you're not wanting to, darken the doors of a church ever again. So, what are three practices that you wish your burner friends, your ecstatic dance friends, your authentic relating friends, what do you wish they knew that were treasures in the storehouse of Christian spirituality?
Hmm. Well, one would be a rather easy shift for many people. A lot of folks have experience with meditation these days, whether it's Buddhist or just a mindfulness practice that isn't overtly Buddhist or anything. And those are good. Sometimes for those that yearn for a sense of communion with the divine and less of a body scan solo kind of inward thing, but a true sense of communing with creator or divinity, however they understand that. There's a practice called centering prayer, which was effectively confined to the cloisters, the monks and nuns and priests had it for a very long time. The Desert Fathers and Mothers had it, and then it stayed in the monasteries. And it wasn't until after Vatican II that it was released. People like Thomas Merton and uh, Basil Paddington, Father Thomas Keating, others helped. Cynthia Bourgeot is now a promoter. Uh, Basically, you're being present to being. Your presence is present to presence. And you begin with a simple prayer word, Abba, God, love, grace, whatever works for you, goddess. And then you say it, choosing your intention to be centered. And then not when, or not if, but when your mind starts doing its thing and your stomach grumbles and you feel awkward, whatever, you notice and you don't fight it. But then you remember you're choosing to be present to presence, and you just gently say your prayer word and you come back to a centered state, being present. And you just say that prayer word as often as you need to. Maybe it's 4 times in 40 minutes, or maybe it's 1,000 times in 40 minutes. It doesn't really matter. Um, and in that practice, let's say 10 to 20 minutes at a time, I think many people do begin to feel a communion, and it's so available. It's right there. Uh, So that's one, and it's not rocket science. You can read more about it, but that's one that to lift up. Um, uh, Perhaps related, there's a practice called Lectio Divina, divine reading. So it's not conventional Bible study. It's a more spiritual, sacramental approach to the scriptures. And you don't even have to do it to the scriptures. You can do it with a poem. You can do it with a painting on the wall. You can really apply this technique in lots of ways. But the idea is to experience something in certain intentions each time. So the first time might be just generally taking it in and seeing how it lands on you, a certain passage of scripture or a poem. And then maybe the next time you say it out loud, and you do it with the intention of what your senses notice: sight, taste, sound, feel, whatever, all your senses. And you just focus on what are my senses telling me in this experience. uh Another time through might be, um what emotional impact am I feeling? What emotions are being evoked? And another time through might be, do I feel, is there a word that's jumping out to me or a phrase that's calling to me? And then another time through might be, is there an invitation for something for me to do? Am I feeling nudged, wooed, inspired in some way? Is there something that this is inviting me to do? And that practice, uh, you don't have to do a ton of research. I do love the historical critical approach to the scriptures, reading it in context, knowing what it might have meant to the original audience. Good stuff. This is separate from that. This is more, letting, sort of like a poetry in a, uh, stream of consciousness kind of approach to poetry. It's how is this landing on me in these different ways, and knowing that there's goodness there, that's somehow enough. There's blessing in that experience. So that's another one, Lectio Divina. Um, hmm. Another one I might share: if you happen to live in a community that has a gospel choir, go to their practices and just be bathed in gospel choir music. If you feel inspired, maybe sing along with them a little bit. Maybe you'll join the choir. But for me, singing in a gospel choir, woo, it is transformative. It is a highlight of a week. It helps you know that your miseries are shared in common with others, which helps, it somehow meets a need. And then it also lifts up the joy. There's always, it's like the Psalms. There's God, where are you? And God, you're there. You're coming around. I know you're going to be there for me. And it honors the full reality of the human condition. So, and if you don't live near where there's an actual gospel choir, listen to music. We have the internet. You can find Kirk Franklin and all sorts of contemporary gospel music. A few years ago, I can't imagine that I would be saying this to anybody, but that's one that I just know will help many people in many ways. And then, going back to something we said earlier, and this, again, Christians don't have a monopoly on this, but it has been a strong suit. Doing something to help others, whether it's solo or find, you could even, you don't have to join a church. If they feed the homeless once a week, the unhoused people, pitch in. They will happily probably take you on as someone who will volunteer, and maybe you drive a truck. Maybe you get some food that the grocery store was going to throw out, but you bring it to the cause. Getting involved in ways that help people. There is, John Wesley talked about how it's almost a sacrament. It's a means of grace where God is communing with you as you are helping others, and you are being transformed in the process. So that's another one to lift up if that's not already part of what someone's doing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love these. Just riffing on them for a moment too. Yeah, I find that centering prayer has definitely been a mainstay for me, and even people who are former, say, Christians or adjacent to Christianity. sometimes find in centering prayer what they don't in more like transcendental meditation techniques, etc., precisely because there is a personal and like heartful dimension of God as love. This is a different tradition, but in Orthodox prayer, of course, one of the ways they describe entering into the process of prayer is descending the mind into the heart and dwelling in heartfulness. And so, yeah, the centering prayer instruction of something like, be present in simple presence to God and to love, but then also be willing to let all thoughts go. But there's even something to that catch and release practice that Cynthia Bourgeault has talked about. She believes is rooted in the very spirituality of Jesus, specifically in this idea of kenosis or self-emptying that is present in the earliest hymn that we have recorded in Scripture in Philippians 4. The idea of, Jesus not considering equality with God something to be grasped, something to be clung to, but instead emptying, taking the form of a servant. But it's an emptying, trusting that there is generous presence, what Jesus names as Abba, this deeply personal and loving dimension of the divine that we can engage with when we are engaging in centering prayer. And similarly, you're talking about that heartful dimension of Scripture. One of the things that I find refreshing about progressive Christianity, unlike the fundamentalism I grew up in, is that we do historical critical analysis. We do try to understand the context and the times and the place, and that even informs my devotional life. But it's really helpful to say that we also can have that heart engagement, which I think is why evangelicalism and particularly Pentecostalism still has so much appeal so many places all over the world, because there is this genuine affective, emotional component to Scripture, to sacred reading, and we would, all benefit from retaining that. Gospel choir, yes, it's so interesting. I feel like all the rage in Asheville these days are various choirs that are either secular or spiritual but not religious, or hippie choirs. There's one called Hark, where they sing all kinds of songs. Sarah's Singing the Wheel of the Year involves like a lot of singing. And similarly, when I helped start the Wild Goose Festival, we imported a practice that arguably goes all the way back to Martin Luther, but certainly in more contemporary times was used with in Greenbelt, which is beer and hymns. Let's sing some songs and drink. And for folks who grew up in religious traditions, sometimes the lyrics of those songs or gospel songs can be triggering. Sometimes the theology can be triggering. But similar to Lectio, where we might be dealing with a difficult passage of Scripture, we don't have to take it at face value. We don't have to take it literally. We can let the song work on us, both in the ways that we affirm it and in the ways that we deny it or wrestle with it. So there's a lot to that, again, somatic practice of using our lungs, using our vocal cords, harmonizing literally with those around us who also have bodies and voices. And yeah, yes to acts of service. And, sometimes congregations can be the most organized and intentional outside of the, governmental service agency, and thinking about like what is actually the long-term witnessing presence of coming alongside those who need this sort of companionship. So absolutely. Well, moving on, your chapter on plant medicine, I think, is one that's likely to grab a lot of readers' attention. Again, I live in the Asheville bubble, so I have no idea what like the wider world or even the wider Christian world thinks about this these days. But I know, 20 years ago, when I was even in like emerging church ministry context, folks would talk about plant medicine in very hushed tones. They were very concerned about who knew that they might be partaking in a breakthrough journey involving psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca or San Pedro. They didn't want people to think that they were druggies or, that somehow they were maybe inviting demons into their lives or something. But your chapter on plant medicine is one of the best introductions to the topic I've read, showing surprising continuities between Scripture Christian tradition. Thank you, Hildegard of Bingen, and indigenous wisdom, where a lot of these practices come from. And you also bring a lot of real balance to the conversation, looking at both the promise and the perils of working with our plant siblings and those who work with them. You name the complexities of cultural adaptation, the potential pitfalls of cultural appropriation, not to mention, sometimes the ethical concerns with some of these, shamanic practitioners and the pay to play consumerism of big shamanism, so to speak. I encourage anyone listening to this, if your interest is piqued, read the full chapter to get a taste of Roger's insights and experience. But can you share a little bit about what working with plant medicine has done for you and how churches being open to these healing modalities could actually help their congregants as well as the wider culture?
Yeah. All right. So let me begin by sharing my experience with plant medicine is more vast than many people and more sparse than many people. I've had 4 experiences with ayahuasca, which is a tea originally out of Peru. And I've had, maybe something like 10 or 11 experiences with psilocybin, commonly known as magic mushrooms. Also some experience with MDMA, but I don't consider that plant medicine. That's more synthetic. So I'm working more with organic in that chapter. Yeah, so my experiences with it, well, obviously good enough where I did them more than once. I can say that I experienced it creates favorable conditions for a variety of things. I would say communion with the divine is profoundly favorable conditions. Self-awareness, awareness of trauma and places that need healing. Yes, actual healing is part of it. And a profoundly increased sense of oneness with all and care of creation. It is an organic experience. Like there's often images that are botanical, like a living plant or tree communing with you. They're not always visuals, but often they're very organic and botanical. I've also experienced my on one journey in particular of really my inner wretchedness, my twisted gargoyle, and I had to own that there's brokenness deeper than the shallow level that daily life would generally keep me at. And like, no, there's no avoiding this. There is some shadow work to do. There is some depths to go to. And so that opened up for me. I would say that I've got a reduced experience of jealousy in life, a more sense of abundance and generosity, less of a sense of scarcity, less fear about anything, including death, a profound sense of like real isness, that like the underlying reality that is God, like we live and breathe and move and have our being. Well, this lifts the veil and well, it's true. And as a result, I things don't shake me as much as they used to. And things that would have led to some depression, well, I might have bad days here and there, but I don't have this climate of depression. I've got, there's an okayness it's more content. Increased contentedness has happened. So those are some things that I would say that I've experienced. Now, in centering prayer, I sometimes experience profound oneness and connection, and even the visuals that sometimes happen with plant medicine show up in my centering prayer experiences. Um, I don't think that that's good or bad or necessary. It's just interesting. Um, but I seem to have more of this ongoing, pervasive sense of divine presence. Like there's less, there is God and there is us. It's more that that whatever distance there is pretty minimal. It is right here. We are living in the divine with us. We are not alone. And how beautiful. And so many studies have been done, and I do a lot of footnotes, a lot of peer-reviewed studies, John Hopkins and the VA, and all sorts of studies showing how profoundly helpful these are. And yes, helping people with mental health issues break free from addictions of other kinds of, more classical drugs, heroin, cocaine, what have you, alcoholism. But profoundly helpful with PTSD and depression. And many people have reported if they were atheist before their experience, dramatically notable reduction in people self-identifying as atheist afterwards. So it may be more effective as an evangelism tool than the conventional approach to evangelism. It many people like, holy wow, oh my God. And yes. Now, Roger of about 10 years ago would have heard someone talking like this and would have been total skeptic. Like, come on. You can't fast track spirituality. You can't just do 20 years of centering prayer. You'll get there. Just trust it. And like, okay, yes. And this is also true too. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do this. And there are certain people who probably shouldn't because of mental health issues or medicines. But it can be a profoundly helpful tool. And so I'm not in like a Pied Piper encouraging people to do this, but I cannot deny what I've experienced. And everyone I've talked to that has done this pretty much has similar enough kinds of transformations. I don't feel a need to have this be an ongoing part of my life. The last time I did a journey of plant medicine was July of 2022. And here we are, spring of 2024. I may do more, but it's not like it's an ongoing, regular part of my journey. That's a lot of answer to your question. How are we doing with the question?
No, I appreciate, all of that context. It sounds like, I mean, you're right. The studies are impressive in terms of how, even one experience with certain kinds of plant medicine can profoundly reduce depression, anxiety, other maladies for the long haul, and are arguably way more effective than certain psychotropic meds under certain circumstances, of course. And it sounds like in your own personal experience that you have had a lot of love, joy, peace, patience, the fruits of the spirit have come into your life. And I could see why, many Christians might feel nervous or territorial even, say, wow, is this some kind of a substitute for, is this a more effective sacrament than what we have to offer, and could feel a bit insecure in the face of plant medicine's obvious efficacy in a lot of ways. But if we do, as you alluded to Augustine earlier, if we look at both the book of Scripture and the book of nature as revealing the grandeur of God, if we follow in the footsteps of folks like Hildegard of Bingen and John Wesley, and deeply appreciate in the plant world, to say nothing, of course, of countless indigenous cultures who do the same, we might realize that all of this goodness has been provided by divine providence and is helpful for us. I've had similar experiences of just an opening of the heart, melting away of some of my grasping and clinging, just enough gap in my awareness to let more peace and ease and beauty in. And I think that if we were as Jesus followers more open to plant medicine, there are even ways that we could help integrate these experiences, even for the wider culture, if we earn their trust.
Yeah.
Because while you haven't partaken of plant medicine in a couple years, I once had a nearly 10-year gap between partaking. There are people who are kind of weekend warriors with this sort of thing, for whom regular imbibing becomes a substitute for other spiritual practices and community and acts of service. And because of also the costs involved with it, like the monetary costs involved, I think that's why groups like Hunt Priest, who wrote your foreword with Ligare, are emerging to say, what if we could actually bring the best of spiritual direction models and parish models of pastoral care into the plant medicine conversation to actually help people integrate their journeys? Because sometimes what I see in the wider spiritual culture is a lack of that integration. And it's kind of like what Buddhist and integral philosopher Ken Wilber talks about, the difference between altered states, i.e. peak experiences, and habituated, stabilized stages of consciousness. That we can have a peak state of consciousness, spike, whether it's a sudden mystical epiphany that comes out of nowhere or a plant medicine experience. But it can actually be dangerous if we then return to our egoic self and think we're somehow special because the plants revealed something to us or God chose us. And without those practices of humility and community, then that can make us half-baked at best. So
very well put. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you want to say any more about that?
Well, I remember at an ayahuasca journey back in 2018, there were probably, I don't know, 14, 15 people in a circle in the room. And I was getting to know the person next to me because we were going to be journeying together 5 hours or so. And I learned that this person in that year had done something like 20 journeys already in that year. And my jaw dropped. I'm like, wow. I was getting ready for my third of the 4 journeys that I did. And
yeah.
I found myself dismayed that somebody would want to do it that often, particularly ayahuasca, which is not an easy journey. And so I didn't want to judge him, but I found myself baffled that another human was making those choices for that frequency. And I was just baffled by it. Now, integration work, I've been blessed with the various communities I've done things with. Integration has been a big part of it. So it's, and I've done some solo journeys where I've made a point to bring in what I've learned from the collective journeys and talk to others and not have it be a total solo thing. Otherwise it's a cheap thrill, getting into a Corvette, seeing how fast it can go, and okay, cool. But how is your life any better because of that? And that's where the rubber hits the road, and writing the details down, and how was this related to your intention, and where do you see work to be done, and how might that show up? Is it a therapist? Is it accountability partner? What is needed to help this next thing to happen further? That work is why it matters. And if you don't do that, it's not frank. It's at that point it's recreational and not sacramental or transformative. And so I'm not an advocate of, well, I'm not a legally, I guess I like that Colorado and is it Washington State have legalized psilocybin. I'm grateful for that. I think it's a good thing. I think more states will do the same. What I personally wouldn't want to see a lot of recreational use of things. I'd rather people to actually benefit and do work, because society needs people doing their work, growing and expanding and healing. So I don't want to be police about it. And I don't know the right way for these things to play out. I don't think it's going to be a good idea for it only to be done by um, MDs and psychiatrists and psychologists. I'm glad that they can do certain things, but I think there's long lineage of ritual and shamans, and those folks know what they're doing. And so many times, I shouldn't be too blunt about that. There are people who really do know what they're doing. And I wouldn't want people to miss out on the transformative accountability piece. Uh, all this to share, I'm going to tie this back to Christianity. One of the things that I think Christianity would do well to remember is, there's a lot of talk about salvation. Are you saved? When were you saved? And they have a rather, I would say, trite, uh, limited understanding of salvation. Salvation in the Hebrew and the Greek is about healing, wholeness, liberation, and that's in the individual and the collective. And if I say I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior on May 18th, 1985, okay, that's something. But one of the blessings of John Wesley is this notion of the threefold flow of grace: prevenient grace before we know there is God or we need God; justifying grace that helps us to get right with God in a certain way. And that's where a lot of the evangelical world stops: justification. But sanctification, sanctifying grace, where Wesley pulled that from the Eastern Orthodox, the deification, the theosis, becoming more like God, becoming fullness into our godly state, the imago Dei, living into it. Well, that requires growth so that more and more of my thoughts, actions, feelings are motivated from a divine place of love rather than Roger's ego and fears. Well, that takes some work. And Wesley, he to his credit, brought about a sense of salvation that's ongoing. That's why we do this work. It's not a one and done thing. And these tools that I talk about in the book are part of expanding the tool belt, the repertoire of helping more people to experience wholeness and transformation and moving on to whether it's Christian perfection or a divine sanctified, the wholeness, our birthright, that we're basically hopes. God hopes this for us. And so many of us are avoiding what could be for us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of when in 2011, my good friend Gareth Higgins and I did a Mankind Project weekend, a men's rites of passage weekend with conscious men's work involving shadow work, involving, facing what we're hiding and denying and repressing, and learning to heal our masculinity, learning to trust our masculinity in a context of other men who were attempting to live more consciously. And I know Gareth wouldn't mind me sharing this because he shares it much often himself. Like he wished that churches that we grew up in had the same commitment to authenticity and to, specifically men expressing our emotions, including expressing anger in a healthy way, but also expressing sadness, grief, love, joy, all of these things. And, I feel like some churches who might be experiencing themselves as dying do feel bewildered, and they wonder where people are going when they're leaving churches. And of course, a lot of them are simply disappearing into their screens and are disappearing into like the loneliness and alienation of late capitalism and how it works us all to the bones. And, like that documentary Bowling Alone 10 or 15 years ago shows that, the atomization of humanity is really a crisis all its own, a loneliness crisis that in some ways was accentuated through the height of COVID. But also some are finding healing and growth in these other kinds of modalities, like plant medicine, like rites of passage, like shadow work. And these don't have to be completely walled silos. We can bring these back into congregational life. We can bring these back into a parish model of the neighborhood and of the community. And they can actually play really nicely together if we give them a chance.
Yeah, well, this is a beautiful conversation that I'm hoping more people are inspired to have these conversations. and be willing to learn from each other and bring out the best, call each other into the best of what we can be. And I want the Christians to be the best Christians they can be, the Muslims, the Jews, the Buddhists, the spiritual but not religious. I want us all to be, whatever we choose, to be the best of that we can be. And hopefully this book will contribute to that cause.
I think it does. I think that what I came away from reading Discovering Fire, especially to mention, we didn't even really address in this interview about how vulnerably you share about your own relational journeys and the ups and downs of connecting with potential partners, and how that works for you or doesn't in different stages and phases of your life, and how that relates to your perceptions of aging. That the sense I get in this is that we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we are, like you say, Jesus followers or Buddhists or pagans or spiritual but not religious, like we're all, as Ram Dass said, walking each other home. And the more we can be open-handed and share the gems of what we have learned while being open-hearted to receive those that others have, it's just going to be a better world for all of us as we face the crises that are pressing on us today, like the climate crisis, like the ongoing rise of fascism in our world and our economic difficulties. So really encourage, anyone to check out Discovering Fire. And Roger, how can people track with you online, potentially read other things that you're writing, or maybe invite you to lead a retreat or give a talk in other people's spiritual communities?
Sure. All right. So first of all, there's a website, rogerwolsey.com. And on there's lots of various pages, video clips and podcasts and things. This will probably end up on that page. There's ways to order either of the two books that have been written so far. I'm pretty sure on there's access to the Roger Wolsey author Facebook page. And there's also the Kissing Fish. There's a fan page for the first book, Kissing Fish, which surprisingly has a large following. And at that point, that's my biggest way of connecting with people. Discovering Fire is the new book, so I'm talking about it and quoting from it every once in a while. It sort of have a life of its own, but I'm very active there on a daily basis. Those are the three main ways. I also am a certified spiritual director, and in fact, I'll be going next month to a retreat where spiritual directors are going to be learning how to do integration work with people who have had plant medicine journeys, and so I'll be all the more honed with that. That said, I'm a pretty busy full-time pastor, and I can't see myself taking on too many clients quite yet. So those are the main ways that people can reach me. And I have done some retreats, just most recently in Phoenix, Arizona, in February, retreat based on various practices highlighted in this book. And that retreat went really well. They want me back every February going forward. So I've got a standing gig in Phoenix every February, which is awesome. But I can do that retreat or something like it in various other places. So I'm happy to do that and help you all connect. And there's resources in your own community, and I'll basically help you get to know those people through the retreats that I'll offer. Yeah.
Thank you, Roger. Yes, we'll include all of these links in the show notes. And again, get thee to Discovering Fire. It is also available in audiobook format. Highly, highly recommend it. Thank you so much for your time today.
All right.